One, two, three. 1, 2, 3. Hey, everybody. Welcome back. Chalkboard History. Second take today. We talked a little bit about everybody's 15th favorite Tennessean, Andy Johnson. So now we're going to talk about Tennessee as a free home or a grave. This actually comes from allegedly a sign in which those words were carved into this sign and nailed to a tree somewhere down on the Tennessee-Alabama line.
Yeah, as those guys are coming
a Confederate soldier or two saw it. What?
It was painted on a banner. It was painted on a cloth.
Oh, listen, I've been corrected by the cameraman.
I thought you were the guy who wrote the book.
I think he must have read that in a fictional novel. I couldn't.
Ding 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 for Adam. Woohoo!
Adam wins. Just why don't you come over here and I'll run.
Actually, that was Wiley Sword's book where I read that, so I really don't know if it's true.
Oh,
well, Sword said.
But he did
take that with a grain of salt.
Oh my
God! He did
God!
have a quote from a soldier who said it was painted.
Well, Wiley Sword said Hood was on laudanum, so God rest his soul. I'm not sure his sources are the most accurate.
Not for context.
All right. Well, somewhere.
All right, Tennessee is a free home, or is it a free home, or is it a grave? What is Tennessee?
Tennessee played a very unique role during and after the war, but it was even this is a unique state even prior to the war. We provide one of the more maybe controversial but important presidents to the United States in the form of Andrew Jackson. I mean, he wasn't born here, but he's from here, and maybe that's a good place to start.
Oh, I love Andrew Jackson.
I do too.
I do. So many people hate Andrew Jackson.
He's fiery.
I shouldn't say I love him because I didn't know him, but he is, unlike Polk, who's kind of with a lot of people, although I don't think he's that, and then Johnson's like, Jackson's just... He's ridiculous. That guy should have a national monument.
Yeah, I mean, he shared obviously some of the prejudices of his time. His role in the Indian Removal Act, of course, gets him a bad rap, although I don't know that he did anything different than any other president would have done in that position. What Jackson was always very clear about, though, was his love of this nation as a united nation.
Right.
He's really the first president who has to.
Oh, he wasn't a Tennessean first. He was
North Carolina, whatever.
He was, but I mean, he was an American.
He was an American, and that's true. That's good.
He saw the country as a real thing, not an abstract idea.
Yeah.
And we see this very early on during the nullification crisis when his inherited vice president, because John Calhoun had been the VP of John Quincy Adams, and he's Jackson's VP, and of course Calhoun takes this position that states could nullify federal law. But let's just get over this hump. That's ridiculous. Okay, the fact that any state thinks they can nullify what Congress passes, you don't have to like it. And right away, I mean, let's just say Jackson just calls bullshit on that. Jackson's like, no, that's not how it works. And so he proceeds to try and teach Calhoun a civics lesson, but it doesn't work out because Calhoun quits.
Because he feels like he can have more say.
Oh, and he was right.
As a senator.
He went back and became a senator from South Carolina, and for the next 20 years, and he outlives Jackson. And it was actually Calhoun's theory, the compact theory, which wins out. And I think that's terribly sad.
I know.
Because
and James Madison's still alive at that point.
Yes.
He gives us the founder's position on that. He says, no, you can't do that. And the reason we didn't write that down is because we thought it was so absurd that nobody would ever try it.
Well, and Jackson actually said it was treason. It was, he threatened to send troops to South Carolina. It is remarkable how in Tennessee that evolution of thought changes, but it doesn't change for a long time. If you went forward 20 years to 15 years to then 20 years when Polk was president, Polk wasn't, and his contemporaries weren't yammering about the state's right to secede. Right. This only really does culminate in the 1850s as Calhoun, as I've said sometimes, those last moments in the Senate when he's sitting there like the emperor. He's, he can't even speak, but he's as
got his little hood on.
He's as potent and dangerous as
Right.
ever. And then he's gone, and then Henry Clay is gone, and Daniel Webster is gone, and this new generation of politicians emerge. And you really start to see the American experiment and Tennessee begin to split because the Republicans emerge. Soon you have Lincoln as the party leader, and on the Democrat side, you have Jefferson Davis. And Tennessee's caught like in a vice, except instead of squeezing it, they're just pulling Tennessee apart. And the state itself, between West Tennessee and East Tennessee, very different. Middle Tennessee is kind of, getting torn, getting jerked around from whether you were in Clarksville or Nashville or Columbia to Shelbyville. There's all these conflicting opinions between Democrats. Nobody's a Republican around here except in East Tennessee.
Right.
You got Democrats, you've got the Whigs. So, let's drill down, right up into the moment of secession. You have Murray County, run by Democrats, the Polks, but the chairs are Whigs.
Yeah.
Franklin, Williamson County, not really any big political family, but run by the Whigs. And people like John McGavick is a Democrat.
We have a lot of contrarians in our houses here.
Right. So what happens to Tennessee in 1860? His election, South Carolina leads. The governor's pants are on fire.
Yeah.
Tell us about Isham Harris in Tennessee.
Yeah, we're having to make a decision about secession here. There's a referendum in February of 1861 as those southern states are dropping like flies. And the first time we vote no. But it is just to show how divided this area is. Murray County voted yes on secession. Williamson County voted no. Nat Chairs, who's here, said he voted no on secession that first time. But after Fort Sumter, Lincoln makes a call for 75,000 troops. And he communicates to Isham Harris, our governor, what our quota is going to be of that. And Isham Harris says, listen, we're not sending you anybody to put down this rebellion. Isham Harris is from West Tennessee, and he holds that secessionist view of the West Tennessee folk. And East Tennessee actually makes a bit of a bid to do what West Virginia is going to eventually do. They try to secede from the state, and Isham Harris dispatches soldiers to make sure that doesn't happen. And so inside this state...
What's good for me is not good for thee.
So inside this state, it's we remain divided, and we will supply 51,000 soldiers to the United States Army, 20,000 of whom or so are black men, and 31,000 or so.
And Isham Harris gets rousted out of the Capitol within a year of the war.
With his tail between his legs, by the way.
Right. Yeah. I was just writing in my new book that for a guy who talked to big game, he sure could run fast out of Nashville. And of course, he then attaches himself to Albert Sidney Johnston, who's his army at Shiloh, and he connects himself with Hood later on.
He'll be here.
Johnson becomes military governor, and Tennessee's always seems to be at this nexus of who we were, what was happening, and where we were going. And so, other than Virginia, Tennessee is as impacted, more battles here than any other state than Virginia, but also I think is impacted as any state. Because, not everything is how big or how many contests. Tennessee was terribly affected by the war. You have these major battles. The country is directly invaded. Grant comes pouring into Tennessee down the rivers because Tennessee offered these arterial inroads to U.S. troops. You got the Mississippi on the west side. You got the Tennessee and the Cumberland River. And so...
and then we're a railroad hub. Nashville's a railroad hub. So once you get down the Cumberland, now you've got access to all these railroads. And Tennessee and Virginia have most of the industry of the South. That's where your forges, your iron foundries, those kinds of things are all happening.
Right. And the Old South really begins to break down because the Civil War becomes essentially a two-front war. You've got the East, you've got the West. And...
we're a gateway. We open the door to
escaped slaves, contraband are an immediate issue the Lincoln administration has to confront. in 61, and then by early 62, the same problem is exploding all over Tennessee. As you've heard me say, it's like a refugee crisis across Williamson and Murray County and Davidson County and Shelby County, as thousands of people are escaping. But then the war changes, and this is where Tennessee, again, is right at the intersection of it all. Lincoln, not an abolitionist, but always bothered by slavery as being anathema to the founding, pushed somewhat, but believed that the war had to be more now than just Union. The war was the way to end slavery because you couldn't deal with it politically.
Right.
So you had to destroy it militarily and then ultimately do a constitutional amendment. So he issues the Emancipation Proclamation. And one of the things that drives me nutso is when people talk about, well, Lincoln didn't care about slavery and that's why Tennessee was exempt. Well, Tennessee was exempt because the U.S. Army controlled almost the entire state by the time of the proclamation. He did it from a moral perspective, but he also did do it. See, two things can be true at the same time. He believed that people should be free, but he was also striking at one of the most important fundamental pillars that had propped up the South and was propping up the Confederate military machine was slave labor. Because what had Confederate leaders been doing? Well, they were shuttling thousands of slaves out into the armies to do all the things that they had always done. Cook, clean, run the curry comb on the horse, saddle it up, basically take care of massa. That's what they're doing. And so Lincoln just goes right at it. And so what's it like in Tennessee as this is unfolding in 63 and 64? What's happening at Rippavilla?
So we have slaves running away everywhere, and many of them are going to become United States Colored Troop soldiers. And we know a number of men are doing that right here at Rippavilla. They're leaving to go become...
We know 12 now, at least 12.
At least 12. And enlisting in a couple of different places, but they're going off to, which means a farm like this now is being evacuated. A lot of people are gone, and they only have to get to Nashville initially, and eventually Franklin builds a Fort Granger, and so then enslaved people only have to get there. So you have contraband camps beginning to grow up in places like Franklin in the shelter of Fort Granger or in Nashville. I mean, you just have contraband by the thousands coming to those places, and they're fleeing. And Tennessee's an easy place to do that because all you got to do is get to the military. Anywhere, Mississippi River, New Orleans, anywhere you have a military concentration. And Lincoln asks Johnson to raise a regiment of black troops. He reaches out to him as military governor. He says, what would be better for the morale of the country than to see a slaveholder in a slaveholding state that raises men to fight to protect the Union?
See, now there's Lincoln's cunning brilliance, knowing that A, this should be done, and B, that it should be done. That there's multiple advantages to this. But I have to say, I was just thinking of something about Rippavilla, like the way that the world comes undone for certain people. Not long ago, a few days ago, I was watching something about World War II, and it was about when Allied troops came across the Rhine. And German civilians, and, of course, many of them were Nazis, but many were not. And these older people, women and children, got their first look at the enemy, and their whole world was coming apart. And all of a sudden, the gloss of, Germany and the fatherland and all that's just being stripped away. And these are, you got troops, you got tanks, you got, the whole world's falling apart. In 62, when Buell's army is moving to Shiloh, William Nelson's division camps here at Rippavilla, and there's about 3 divisions stacked up on the road right out here. 20,000 men. So Nelson's division is the one that's closest, but there's one ahead of him and there's one behind him. Well, they got stacked up on the road because the bridge over Rutherford Creek was out. Well, Nat's gone. Susan's here. So you have a woman with her kids. Jenny's an adult, But the others are, still kind of tiny, right, 6 or 7. Oh my goodness. There's a sense of, you can have sympathy, even if sometimes the characters aren't terribly sympathetic, because it's easy to say, well, they deserved it. Well, yeah, maybe so. But that doesn't mean that there weren't real emotions and fears, because all of a sudden, a year after the war had started, your entire world is falling apart. But at the same time, somebody else's world is expanding. And these young black men, middle-aged black men, finally going beyond the boundaries of a place like Rippavilla or 1,000 other places from Virginia to Texas, taking freedom into their own hands. But that's happening in Tennessee, and that is an incredible part of the history of the state. And you see these black men joining these units. You've heard me say this, like when we worked through the Fuller story. Is there anything more noble than a person fighting for something that they can't really see? You don't own it. It isn't your house or your land or a body. You're fighting for this idea of freedom, of liberty, of the United States. And all of a sudden, these white dudes in blue uniforms are seeing black dudes in blue uniforms, and they tentatively form this union themselves. That's happening in Tennessee. Meanwhile, there's other white dudes in like butternut and gray uniforms that are like, oh my God.
The world is upside down.
What is happening?
Yeah.
So we know how the war ends. You've got the Battle of Franklin. You've got the end of the war. And is it any wonder, we touched on this in the Johnson episode, but we can talk about it here too. Is it any wonder that Tennessee then became like at the forefront of all of this conflict? Because it was so much change. And
so fast.
So fast, so much racial change, so much bloodshed, so many empty tables, including the Chairs family. I mean, goodness gracious. Nat lost at least 4 nephews during the war. I mean, this was his brother and his sister's kids. They all knew about this, and now slavery is over. There's a whole new social order. And is it any wonder that when the General Assembly started passing laws like giving black men the right to vote, I know it's easy for us to sit back and go, well, that's just because they were racist. Well, I'm old enough to remember when the idea of gay people being married would have sent the majority of the country literally into spasms.
And it's just not that long ago.
And it's not that long ago. Yeah. And so is it little wonder that Tennessee ended up with a governor that was, a lot of people thought Brownlow was ramming stuff down their throats.
And he's doing that partly to protect himself, because he knows that black men are going to vote for him, but those former Confederates are not. And so it's in his, and that's, yes, this is a great book too.
Yeah. I mean, is it any wonder that people started to mask up and take matters into their own hands because they didn't feel like, well, there's no police or whatever there were run by radicals, and then the radicals are running everything up in Congress. And it's not an excuse, but it's a reality. And so Tennessee's on fire, especially this area.
Right.
For the better part of a couple of years. This isn't like 2 weeks of rioting or a month of trouble. This went on, for 2 years, right?
Yeah. And the Ku Klux Klan formed just down the road from here, not that far away, by 6 men, May of 1866, at least 3 of whom
were in Nat Chairs' regiment, the 3rd Tennessee.
And
they also first met at the law office of Thomas Jones, who was Nat's wife, Susan. Thomas was her first cousin.
Oh, Lord.
It's not like these people probably didn't have some idea what was going on.
Right. And some of the first sightings of the Klan are when they're still in a not so angry state. It's more of a social club. You have jousting tournaments going on here. Nat was a judge at one of those. And there are some Klan members that show up. They've got their little flag. And at that point, it's almost farcical. It's almost like something out of a minstrel show or something.
Yeah, there's something going on. I've learned a lot more about this, though, from the newspapers. You first start to see the words Ku Klux, Ku Klos, or Ku Klux Klan show up in the newspaper literally within a month of black men getting the right to vote. That is not a coincidence.
Right.
So I think those initial 6 guys were up to no good. I think that they were up to scaring people, intimidation. Because if you were a free black person in Tennessee, it's not like it was super comfortable everywhere you went. So these 6 guys are, Don't
forget.
I think I kind of even reject the idea of a social club because I think these guys were up to something. But it is the action by the General Assembly that ignites a fire under 6,000 other people. And it quickly becomes violence. And contrary to what a lot of people think, the Klan in 67 and 68 weren't killing a lot of people. There were murders like Samuel Byerfield in Franklin, who was killed right after William Guthrie was killed. So Byerfield was white and Jewish. Guthrie was black, had been accused of attacking a white woman, raped her. So, of course, he had to die. But primarily, the Klan was good at beatings, threats, intimidation. But the other thing, I learned this from the paper, you know what they were good at? They were good at walking around the streets in their outfits. So everybody knew they were around. The guy, one of the original Klan members, ran the Pulaski paper. And the Nashville paper started picking up on what the Klan was doing. And the guy down there, Frank McCord, actually wrote an editorial. And he said that old granny that runs the Nashville paper should come down to Giles County and take the masks off and find out who these Klan members are. It's like a direct challenge.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, why don't you come down here? Why don't you come down here and take our masks off and see who we are? That's the moment when it stops being funny. And that's early. And I think that the evidence is abundantly clear then. There's no reason to even question that Forrest got involved because so many of his contemporaries said he was involved.
Yeah.
And of course, when he was asked, Forrest would say, I wasn't in the Klan. How many men were in the Klan? Oh, the 40,000 in Tennessee. How many are in the South?
Everything about them.
500,000.
Yeah.
Did he know about Byerfield being killed in Franklin? Yep.
Of course he did.
And this is all happening right here in Tennessee. And this is a part of the history of this state that we've often, it's yucky. We don't want to talk about, or it wasn't like that. It was.
It was like that, and everybody knew. Even if you weren't, we've struggled about, you think Nat was a part of the Klan, and we don't know. We have no evidence one way or the other, but even if you are not,
right,
you know who those men are, you know what's happening, and it's accomplishing an end that you probably want yourself too. Maybe you would never go out and be the one who's doing the beatings, but if it keeps those black men from voting, because again, we're looking at a season here where black men have been given the vote, former Confederates are disenfranchised, and so it's a complete upheaval. And if the only way to fix that is to keep those black men from not
That's a great point because it is the two things combined.
Yeah.
The white men not being allowed to vote was one thing, but when black men could and white men still couldn't, that was the end of the world. And then when you go forward, Brownlow leaves, he becomes a senator. DeWitt Center becomes governor. The state constitution was changed in 1870, so black men could still vote, although there was a poll tax language thrown in, and then white men could vote. So that was the byproduct of the 1870 Constitution. Interesting history note. Black men could vote in Tennessee until 1834. The Constitution was changed in 1834, which then turned it only into white men. And then so in 1870, there were no racial restrictions. And the poll tax is especially punitive because the poll tax, as we know over time, it spreads out from Tennessee to a lot of other states, and the poll tax also afflicted a lot of poor whites. Mm-hmm. And that's the part, I think, as a historian, as someone who works in this field, if you're honest, you begin to really see that upper crust of white society, the political establishment, the powerful and the wealthy, they start doing to many poor whites what they had done to them before the war, which was they sent them off to fight. They became the cannon fodder, and they're willing to sacrifice many poor whites so that blacks couldn't vote.
Well, because we really don't need either of their opinions. They're all ignorant. They're all
Yeah.
poor, so just don't give them a voice.
And that's a word that's used in the newspapers a lot, the ignorance, the ignorant masses. I actually saw for the first time the term cracker.
Oh, gosh.
Yeah. Poor white crackers. And it wasn't a black guy that was writing the article. This was an editorial about poor white crackers in Tennessee in the 1870s because they were accusing them of mingling with Negroes. And so right there, you see there's a common bond among the poor. They band together to eat, to farm, to try and survive.
Make music.
And to make music. And then there's these people over the top that are still running the machine. And last thing before we finish up, I was thinking about the old Whig Party. The chairs eventually, just like everybody else, predominantly who was white, they became Democrats. And when Grant won the election in 68, he won in Tennessee. And then he lost Tennessee in 72. Why? Because white men could vote. So Horace Greeley, the newspaper editor, won. And Greeley died, before the electoral voters met. But anyways, Grant lost, and not another Republican won in Tennessee until Dwight Eisenhower.
Good grief.
Except William Harding won a single race in the 20s. I mean, think about that. From 1868 until 1950, I don't know whether Eisenhower won in 52 or 56, a Democrat won every single presidential race in Tennessee, whether they won the presidency or not. And most of the time in that era, the Democrats weren't winning. So Tennessee literally was voting for the loser almost every time for half a century.
That's so weird.
But that was how...
But I think it is almost that slingshot reaction, because when the 15th Amendment finally rolls around and comes to Tennessee, we don't approve it.
And why not?
Because because by that point we had buyer's remorse.
Oh,
we were like, this is not working out.
This is a great...
We did this, and this was a bad idea.
You
don't think so?
I don't think so. I think that was the root of it, but what they said made sense.
What'd they say?
The state had already given black men the right to vote.
What's the point?
And because voting on... States still run the elections.
Okay.
So the states had made the decision, and out of principle, they weren't going to do it. So they didn't ratify it.
We circle around in what, 1970?
No, 1997. Tennessee was the last state in the country.
That's so funny.
To ratify the 15th Amendment, and
awful or whatever.
And it was unanimous in the House, which was I think 97-0, and in the Senate it was 27 or 28-0. So
Which is ironic, considering we were the first Confederate state to ratify the 14th Amendment and only the third period overall.
Yeah.
I mean, so we're on the forefront there.
Well, it shows that what was happening in that period right after the war was, to use a modern term, it was extraordinarily progressive. What Brownlow was doing, whether you like him or not, was taking the approach that the people who had supported the Confederacy had to pay a price. And as I've been writing in my new book, I think one of the things that really has plagued us with a country, which spins out of Tennessee into a lot of the former Confederacy, was there was no Marshall Plan. There was no Marshall Plan, which wasn't just about rebuilding and infrastructure. It was about not abandoning the commitment that had caused the war and what its final outcome was. And that the Marshall Plan did something that I think was profound, that we're finally coming out of in the South. The Marshall Plan made sure that generations of Germans and Japanese did not make the same mistakes, would not repeat the same errors. It has only been in the post-civil rights era that the South has moved beyond the hero worship of everything Confederate and has really become part of the United States. And you think about what Japan and Germany became in the world, there are some of our greatest allies, and that the South has once again taken its place as an important and pivotal economic part of the United States. It isn't just the standalone thing. And I think that's really good. That's why people are moving here. That's why people are visiting here. And I think,
here?
Well, I think me and about 80% of the people that live in Tennessee now, but they're coming from all over. Yeah. And they're coming for a lot of different reasons. And I think that's great. That's a part of Tennessee's history. as
be
well
proud of, yeah.
come full circle. And I think maybe somewhere Andy Jackson would be like, see, I told you so. It was better to be part of the United States than to be out of it.
Yeah.
And he said that now almost 200 years ago. Somewhere John C. Calhoun in the depths of somewhere across the river Styx is probably upset at what
rolling
happened.
around in his grave.
But oh well, Lincoln and Jackson, I think, would be happy. And I think Frederick Douglass would be happy. And I think people like Jerry Chairs, who came from here, I think they would be happy with where Tennessee has finally gotten, for the most part. All right, thanks, everybody.